Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, NCAA Tournament Sweet 16 edition from the field of 68. We are now down to 16 teams vying to cut down the nets in just 2 short weeks. And as we always do around these parts, we bring in our own cast of all-stars to jump into the mix and break down some of these college basketball games. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined this week by our in-house analyst and professional sports bettor, Billy Attridge. Billy, I'm glad to see you survived your Vegas sojourn, my friend, and hopefully you are back in your humble abode, strapped in and ready to roll with 15 games in the NCAA tournament remaining.
I love this time of year, man. Vegas was awesome. It's always good to get down there, go down with a couple buddies, some family members, and we watch the games. But getting back now and seeing that we have a kind of an all-star Sweet 16 gets the juices flowing. So happy to be here. Thanks for the invite as always.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, so much of the tournament, we talk Cinderella stories, we talk bubble teams going into Selection Sunday and everything else along those lines. But I think you nailed it. When you look at the matchups that we have on the docket, and we'll cover all 8 games on the slate in one capacity or another today, this is a college basketball fan has to be that much more exciting than the Cinderella-laden field we had last year where no number 1 seeds were able to make a deep run. And while it's a great storyline for the program like FAU and what it does to season tickets for the upcoming season, San Diego State's improbable run, this is the Blue Bloods. These are the teams you want there. And while I hate to give the committee credit, when all the 1s and 2s get through to the Sweet 16, you look at the matchups that we have in front of us, and I have to imagine even the most casual fan will be locked and loaded for all 8 of these games. No
doubt. And, the betting market itself is revealing, what they think of these matchups. We obviously have the big UConn spread, but everything else is playing around 2 or 3 possessions. And as a basketball purist, a fan of the game, it's like Christmas morning come these Thursday and Fridays, because you're going to get good matchups, you're going to get some all-star players, and you're not really worried about a game getting out of hand by 20 or 25 points. Not saying it can't happen, certainly, but going into these games, you have, especially this year, you have some great coaches still advancing. So, yeah, as much as people get bummed when there's not these big upsets in the round of 64 and 32, when this Thursday and Friday come for the Sweet 16, it's really special as a college basketball fan.
Wild to see when you look at double-digit favorites through the first 4 days of the tournament. They go 15-2 against the number.
Crushed.
The only 2 teams that failed to cover actually lost their games outright. Auburn going down at the hands of the Ivy League champion in Yale. And, of course, the Kentucky Wildcats, who seem to always make spring break plans that keep their schedules wide open for the Sweet 16, lose outright to the Oakland Golden Grizzlies. But here we are, and you mentioned it. One thing before we get into some of the games, I want to give a shout-out to Tim Murray and Jim Root, who did an outstanding job last weekend breaking down the field of 64. Tremendous feedback from all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners. So thanks to those guys, and we'll see maybe get them back in the fold for the Final Four as well with you, Billy. But let's go region by region. We'll go in rotation order as much as anything else, and we'll kick things off on Thursday with the late game between Illinois and Iowa State. But when we look at the East Regional odds, we've seen UConn balloon out to a $1.90 favorite. They're followed by Iowa State, a shade north of 4-1, Illinois, shade north of 6-1, and San Diego State, the long shot at 13-1. Of course, that UConn price changes dramatically when you looked at the bracket layout, anticipated a potential showdown against Auburn. We don't get it, and it's a rematch of last year's national championship. And when we try and lay out the resumes for these 2 teams and how they got here, Illinois knocks off Morehead State. It was a little back and forth in the first half before their skill set and offensive prowess reigned supreme in the second half when they found some separation, and they absolutely sandblasted Duquesne in a game that was never competitive after the Illini led 27-11 right out of the gates and continued to extend there. Meanwhile, for the Cyclones, they needed a little bit of separation in the second half against South Dakota State, covering by the narrowest of margins, winning by 17 as a 15.5-point favorite, and against Washington State, where we did see money come in on the Cougars against the Cyclones from 7.5 down to 6.5. Iowa State's defense just stymied Kyle Smith's Cougars in that spot, leading Kyle Smith to take a new head coaching job at Stanford. And I think, Billy, when we look at this game right now, where Iowa State is a 1.5-point favorite, number down from 2.5, total on the game 146 for a contest that'll take place at TD Garden in Boston. Illinois offensive prowess, number one in the country in offensive efficiency. We've seen how dynamic this team is with Terrence Shannon back in the fold. We know what Marcus Damas brings. Coleman Hawkins, a nice compliment. Against an Iowa State team who seems to be nameless and faceless, but it's plug and play for TJ Otzelberger's bunch, where defense has been their calling card. When you look at a matchup like this, we always say great defense beats great offense, at least in the olden age. Is it the same scenario that we think will unfold Thursday night in Boston between the Big 12 and the Big 10?
This is the perfect, to bring up a boxing or MMA analogy where it's styles make fights. And Iowa State, number one in defensive efficiency in college basketball in the regular season. And we've just recently seen Illinois jump UConn to grab that number one offensive spot. And again, when we look at Illinois, it's like this is a team that gets out in transition. They're very big. They're athletic. They probably are always going to have the best scorer in the game on the court for them in Terrence Shannon. And, like you said, Iowa State, it's kind of the nameless, faceless defenders under TJ Otzelberger, who's done a fantastic job. I lean towards the defensive team here in Iowa State. And the big concern for them would be, can they score enough to kind of overcome the inevitable Illinois run, offensive run? We know Illinois is going to go on an 8-10-0, 8-0, 10-0 run in a game like this. They just score too fast, too quick, and they're too efficient. But I will say Iowa State is elite in half-court defense and in the transition game. They're great at putting opposing guards kind of in hell with Tamin Lipsey and Keyshawn Gilbert. Tamin Lipsey, I believe, 6th in steal percentage in all of college basketball. And Illinois doesn't really have that true point guard. They use Domask and Shannon to bring the ball up a bunch. But this game, if Iowa State can make this a half-court game and make Illinois consistently score in the half court, I think it's going to create some problems for Illinois. But that being said, I totally understand why the market went from 2.5 to 1.5 in this one. I just don't think we're going to get to a point where, if this is not crossing pick, we're going to see a buy order on Iowa State if this gets down to pick. We're not going to see Illinois become a favorite in this game.
When you look at Illinois, and you mentioned them moving to number one in the country in an offensive efficiency capabilities, I mean, over the last 5 games, this is a group from a points per possession standpoint, 1.1, 1.3, 1.36, 1.33, 1.42. So we know how dynamic they can be. Now, where Illinois' shortcomings do manifest is on the defensive end, where they're a fringe top 100 team in defensive efficiency. Not what we've grown accustomed to from the Bob Huggins coaching tree, and you figured you'd get a little bit more for Brad Underwood. And when you begin to dissect what TJ Otzelberger's bunch wants to do on offense, it feels like there's a different player that has to elevate his game on a night-in, night-out basis. Do you worry at all about Iowa State having the firepower to keep up with Illinois when they do go on the inevitable runs that you mentioned?
I do worry a bit, but to bring up the point that you brought up, which was how porous Illinois is on the defensive side of the ball, and anyone who does college basketball betting at a semi-high level uses Bartovic. And when you're on Bartovic's site, you can kind of filter out which profiles teams have that go furthest in the tournament. And Illinois, the similar profiles to Illinois only averaged 1.0 tournament wins, while Iowa State was 4th highest at 2.8. So it does show that defense tends to win out in these matchups. Obviously, you need to score. They do have some weapons, though. They have the freshman shooter, Milanovic, I believe his name is, who can stroke it from deep. You wonder if Lipsy is going to be put in situations where he's going to need to hit the deep shot. All in all, though, I do think this game's going to be played in the half court quite a bit, and that is advantage Iowa State. TJ Otzelberger gets a lot of credit for his defensive looks, but he is not a bad offensive coach either. We saw that a lot when he was at South Dakota State.
I'm going to be so interested to see when we look at Iowa State's defensive metrics. I mean, 10 straight contests where they've held opponents under a point per possession. That doesn't happen by dumb luck, by any stretch of the imagination. And even for people that didn't watch Iowa State in their first two tournament games, they may have flipped on that Saturday during conference tournament week and see them completely stymie and shut down the Houston Cougars in the Big 12 championship game. They do force turnovers at one of the highest rates, and I think one of the points you made definitely should resonate in the handicap, that Illinois' lack of a true point guard, if they're going to have to operate in the half court, not be able to get out in transition, may lead to some shaky possessions, some ill-timed shots, and if they're going to try and force looks, it won't end well. Final thing on this game, when you look at the total, knowing that Iowa State wants to play a little bit more in the half court, Illinois would love to turn this thing into a track meet like we saw against the Wisconsins and the Nebraskas of the world in the Big Ten tournament. Correlated Iowa State to the under, in your opinion, or can you see a scenario where Iowa State's able to win this basketball game and it still potentially leaks over a total sitting at 146?
Definitely correlated, but you do have to bring up the fact Illinois hasn't played to a total this low since Iowa on March 10th, and before that it was Indiana on January 27th. They just don't play to totals this low, right? They're going to pick up the pace. Illinois is going to score. They are too talented to not score. However, it's can they be efficient in a very slow-paced game? Because Iowa State, again, is very good in transition. They're going to get back. That is definitely going to be a talking point for Otzelberger. So, in general, yes, correlated. More for Iowa State covering than I think it would be, I think Illinois is gonna win this game and it's gonna go over. I think Iowa State can win a game that's played at a higher pace, but if we see this close 145 and it doesn't reach the total, that's a big indicator that Iowa State's gonna win this game.
Makes a ton of sense knowing that the Illini have now gone over the total in all 5 of their postseason games this year and 18 of 21 overall. So clearly odds makers have not done the best job forcing bettors into a bit of a conundrum at the window. It's essentially Illinois playing, I'm betting the game over, and I'll look to cash my tickets 2 hours later. They've gone over by an average of 15-plus points per game in the 2 tournament games thus far. From the late game in Boston, though, Billy, will go into the early contest, and it's going to feel like a de facto home game and stores north of sorts for a UConn team who Danny Hurley had some harsh comments for the committee. Maybe he softened his stance a little bit when he realizes the luxury they'll have in this particular spot with the Aztecs playing the late game on Sunday night across the country in Spokane, now having to travel to Boston, and it's part of the reason that we see the Aztecs as an 11-point underdog in this spot. Total on the game, 135.5. We did see some shops open this total as low as 134, others open as high as 136, and we've kind of hit that equilibrium point of sorts. Before we get into some of the X's and O's with such a hefty number here, when you handicap the travel, the potential home court advantage, do you feel the betting market reflects the edge that San Diego State is going to have, that UConn is going to have, knowing that San Diego State has to cross the country, the body clocks are screwed up from the last game on Sunday, essentially the first game of the next round. Danny Hurley going to have all of his fans in tow. Going to be a much different atmosphere for UConn in this spot in the Sweet 16 than what I saw out here in my backyard in Vegas last year.
For sure. And to your question, do I think the market's reflected that? I do to an extent. We made this game a little bit shorter, and but I'm not surprised to see this leak out to 11, especially when you consider some of San Diego State's deficiencies on the offensive end. A 3-minute scoring drought in this game could completely open it up for UConn. You get the crowd involved, and this thing could spiral. So it's going to be really imperative for San Diego State to keep this game within 3 to 4 possessions throughout. If you start to see this thing go and a couple big shots get hit by UConn, San Diego State has some poor offensive possessions, this number starts to make a lot more sense.
When you look at the Aztecs' road to get to this point in the tournament, they knock off UAB 69-65, where the Blazers took a ton of sharp money in that game with that number going from 7.5 down to 6.5. San Diego State absolutely bludgeons Yale to the tune of 85-57. The Aztecs led 21-12 after 10 minutes, and it was a 24-point margin by the time they got to the break. But when San Diego State shoots 13 of 27 from beyond the arc, there are very few teams in the country who are going to be able to keep pace. Meanwhile, for UConn, knocking off Stetson 91-52 and easily dispatching Northwestern 75-58 in a game whose final score looked to be much more competitive than the game actually was when UConn took its foot off the accelerator. And this will be the first time that we see the Aztecs program as a double-digit underdog since 2019. I think the 2-minute handicap on this game and asking you the question in terms of how to go about assessing it is as straightforward for me as, can Jaden Ledee go for 25, 30, 35? Because that may be what it takes if the Aztecs are going to pull off an outright upset against the UConn team that's absolutely humming on the defensive end, and we know how brutally efficient they can be on offense. Even at points, they're overly methodical.
Yeah, great point about Ledee. And, there's another universe, really, where UAB wins that game against San Diego State. San Diego State made some ridiculous tough shots, especially Jaden Ledee, as he does. So I'm not going to try and say that this is just such an outlier for this team. But, they were down late in that game, and they had some turnaround fadeaway jumpers that they hit that kind of put them in cruise control down the last minute. But Jaden Ledee hasn't seen bigs like UConn's. Klingon and Johnson's, 6'10", it feels like they're going to have him covered there, and they're going to make this San Diego State team shoot well and shoot well from deep. It's tough to envision a scenario where Ledee does go for 25 and UConn just struggles too much on the offensive end to make this a game where San Diego State can win outright. Usually, especially in March, I'm trying to stay away from teams I don't believe can win the game. I don't believe San Diego State can win this game. This isn't last year's San Diego State team where they had a Matt Bradley who provided just competent shot-making ability from deep. They're 298th in three-point rim rate per shot quality. They rely on those tough two-pointers. And UConn's top 7 in 2-point percent defense. They're 13th in defensive block percentage. It's going to be a tough night for Ledee.
Who is the player to watch for UConn? I know with a big number here, they have a number of guys that can go off. When you look at how Newton, Spencer, and Castle all contribute from the guard position, we know what Klingon and Karaban can do in the front court. Is there a player that you want to watch for UConn that you think has a truly favorable matchup, knowing that San Diego State is definitely known for its defensive DNA, but this group of Aztecs seems to be a cut below what we saw from the team last year that got to the national championship?
Yeah, I think a lot of UConn comes back to Tristan Newton, and can Darian Trammell, who's a fantastic on-ball defender, can he bother him enough? He's a little bit on the shorter side, and Newton's obviously a bigger guard, but we haven't seen Newton really get flustered. He just doesn't get flustered. He makes great decisions consistently. UConn runs fantastic sets. Castle's just an incredible athlete who, even as a freshman, he's going to be an NBA stud soon. If Trammell can't bother Newton in the backcourt, and UConn can consistently get the ball into Klingon, it feels like Ledee might be on the bench more than usual in a game like this, and that's how we can see UConn covering this number. I'm not saying that, obviously every point we're making is a little bit pro UConn, but in a game that's lined 11, you're going to get that. So the big thing for San Diego State is, can they bother this backcourt enough? And personally, I don't see that.
When you look at this UConn Huskies team going back to the start of last year's run to the national championship, UConn a robust 8-0 straight up. That doesn't stand out nearly as much as the fact that they're also 8-0 against the number. So odds makers selling the Huskies a little bit short, as they've won every tournament game over the last season plus by 13 plus points. The Aztecs come in on a modest 0-4-1 ATS run as an underdog. It speaks a little bit about the superiority of athletes, and we'll see if Jaden Ledee can put together a game for the ages. Did get himself into foul trouble against Utah State in the Mountain West Conference semifinals. Still went for 20-plus in that spot, so should be an interesting game where they'll no doubt have a throng of UConn faithful there. Short trip from Storrs up to Boston for very much a home court advantage that I think could truly pay dividends if it doesn't in this game in a potential Elite Eight matchup against the winner of Illinois-Iowa State. From east to west we go, Billy, and when we look at the Western Regional, Arizona still remains the favorite to come out at plus $1.20. North Carolina behind them right around plus 175. Then it's the Alabama Crimson Tide at plus 475, and the Clemson Tigers, the only underdog to win their game outright in the round of 32, priced at plus $8. When we look at Alabama and North Carolina, it is the highest total that we'll see in the round of 16, and at the highest total by some margin north of 20 points, and you can understand why. It's UNC, a 4.5-point favorite in this game. Total sits at 173.5. And when we look at how Alabama was able to get here, they took care of Charleston in typical Alabama fashion, outscoring some of their defensive issues, dropping 109 on the Cougars in a 109-96 win and cover. Following that up in one of the more interesting games, because it felt like there were more players on the floor at any juncture in the game than there were shots falling, in a 72-61 win against Grand Canyon. The shooting came back to earth a bit in that spot for Alabama, going 8 of 31, but you did see them ratchet up some of their defensive intensity. Meanwhile, North Carolina easily dispatched Wagner 90-62 as a massive favorite in their opening round game, and then used a 20-1 run against Tom Izzo's bunch in the round of 32 to get through Michigan State 85-69. They held Sparty to less than 1 point per possession, and Michigan State did so shooting 38% from beyond the arc. This clearly projects to be the fastest game we'll see, 75 possessions or thereabouts. When you look at trying to assess Alabama the way they're currently constructed against a North Carolina team that can score and has their defense a little bit underrated at points, what are the things that stand out to you, whether it's in the number or the matchups that you want to see unfold out in Los Angeles?
Yeah, so this really should be a high-flying up and down type of game. Alabama and Nate Oates, they don't really slow down for anyone. And one team plays a semblance of defense in North Carolina, and I shouldn't even say semblance. I mean, they entered the tourney as the sixth most efficient a defense in the country, and they defend very well in transition, while you have an Alabama team that's extremely inconsistent on the defensive end. If North Carolina can take away the advantage that Alabama normally has on the offensive board, and North Carolina's 9th in defensive rebound percentage, it's going to be tough to see Crimson Tide get enough stops to keep up here, especially considering UNC hits that offensive glass really hard. And that's where Alabama struggled. They rate 225th in defensive rebound percentage. This isn't for me, and we talked about this yesterday, this isn't a game I really want to be involved with pre-game, with the amount of variance that comes with Alabama games in the three-point shot. I certainly lean North Carolina. I lean the team that actually plays some defense and can rebound really well. Again, though, this is a game that the refereeing is going to be big. Alabama's 10th in free throw percentage. They're 78.4% in the regular season, and they shoot a ton of threes, 36.7% from three-point. They were top 30 entering the tourney. So there's a lot of variance here. It just feels like North Carolina does have some answers for Alabama, while I don't think I can say the same on the other side. You mentioned it yesterday. Mark Sears can be a guy who can put up 30. They got to take away his left side. He's fantastic with the ball in his left hand. If they can force him more right, we could see Alabama actually struggle a bit on the offensive end, even at a quicker pace.
When you look at the head coaches in this matchup, I know North Carolina fans have been somewhat ambivalent towards Hubert Davis. We saw the run that he put together 2 years ago before they came up just short in the national championship game. Last year, they're on the outside looking into the big dance, but it's hard to ignore what he's done in terms of exceeding odds makers' expectation in the big dance. A perfect 8-0 against the spread in 8 tournament games, and some of the in-game adjustments that he can make. Do you give a coaching nod to Hubert Davis and some of his versatility, or do you think Nate Oates can get the best, or it's a little bit more difficult because Alabama, to your point, wants to play one way and one way only, and they're going to live by the sword, but they've also been known to die by it at the same time?
I think it's the latter. And I think Nate Oates had a ton of success at Buffalo, especially when he got those talented guards, because he allowed his kids to play fast and get off threes, and he understood that high variance games as an underdog works out really well. When he upset Arizona back in the tournament at UB as a 9-point dog, he utilized that strategy. But now he's got top level talent, and he's still playing this style where you would think would be favorable, right? You got the best talent on the floor, you want as many possessions as possible, but sometimes his kids are just relying on bad 3-point looks. And Hubert Davis, I'm a Duke fan, I love Duke, and so I've never trying to compliment UNC. And when he was hired, I actually was like, I didn't think it was this big upgrade for North Carolina, but he's proved me wrong. His teams play a lot more buttoned up than I assumed they would. So I kind of do lean Hubert Davis in this matchup, especially because you mentioned it, Todd. We saw the adjustments he made versus Michigan State, and his teams are they're getting good looks. RJ Davis doesn't get enough credit as a point guard running the show here. So I lean Hubert Davis. I lean North Carolina. Obviously, it'll take some good 3-point variance for Alabama to win this game, but that's not out of the question with how talented that team is.
It's always so interesting watching the game for North Carolina and Michigan State. You see Sparty get off to that early lead, and apparently Tom Izzo, far be it for me to criticize one of the best coaches that we've ever seen in a college basketball game, but I'm sure he realizes you can't take those timeouts with you, and somewhere along the way, you need to settle things down a little bit when it starts to snowball on you. North Carolina used that big run, and it served as a catalyst to get them to this point in the tournament. You mentioned it. When you look at this North Carolina team, very veteran-laden with Cormac Ryan, Armando Bacot, who feels like he's been at college at North Carolina for about 30 years right now. RJ Davis taking over the point guard position, and more about the man he replaced in just a second. But it's been an interesting team to watch, and when you look at some of the numbers, we saw them take a little bit of money as far as big picture national title future odds at around 18-1 before the tournament started, but still listed as the second favorite in the region, and that's because the potential showdown between an Arizona team that can be as good as anyone in the country when they're playing their best, but we've also seen the floor drop out in the past for Tommy Lloyd's team. But this may potentially be a favorable matchup where Arizona enters in the early game as a 7 to 7.5 point favorite against Brad Brownell's Clemson Tigers. Total in this game sits at 151.5, 152, and appears like most games that we've seen so far for the round of 16. Not much in the way of line movement. Arizona should potentially have a decided home court advantage in Los Angeles. We know there are a lot of proud Wildcat alums who make Southern California their home. Not quite sure it'll feel the same way as Boston will for UConn, but something to factor in here. When we look at the Clemson Tigers, beat New Mexico in the first round in dominant fashion, 77-56, held the Lobos to less than 0.8 points per possession. Lobo shot just 3 of 23 from beyond the arc. But the one thing about Clemson, and that they may have to overcome in this spot, is they struggle on the offensive glass. A -7 differential in that department in that game. And they followed it up with a -8 ratio against Baylor, but they held Baylor to less than 1 point per possession, and it paid dividends. The Bears struggled to shoot the ball from deep, going just 6 of 24. Meanwhile, for Arizona, we know they want to get out and push whenever possible. Easily dispatched Long Beach State 85-65, but did not cover as a 20.5 point favorite. And then were able to extend late against the Dayton Flyers, a game where we saw Arizona bet down as low as 8. They end up winning that game by double digits with 4 players finishing the contest in double figures. Billy, these are two of the best shooting teams in the nation. When you look at some of the numbers that are there, both rank inside the top 20 offensively in overall shot quality, but they like to go about their business in very different ways. Clemson extremely comfortable playing in the half court, and with the Arizona Wildcats, there's nothing they'd love more than to turn this into a frenetic pace and force Clemson to match them bucket for bucket.
Yeah, you hit the spot on there. I think this is, again, similar to Illinois and Iowa State. This is a pace matchup. And Clemson's 262nd in pace. And I think it would be wise for them to implement a slower strategy as they did versus New Mexico and Baylor. You know, Clemson ranks 344th in defensive turnover percentage. And you don't want to get in a track meet with a team with more possessions where you're not turning them over. Especially a team like Arizona, who's 26th in assists per field goal made. They pass the ball extremely well. They get quality looks from deep. And Clemson's 286 in three-point attempts allowed per game. So when you're putting that all together, you want less possessions if you're Clemson in a game like this. The battle on the boards would be a good one. You mentioned it. Clemson hasn't been great on the defensive boards in the tournament, even though entering the tournament, they were 35th in defensive rebound percentage. They're a big team. 3 through 5, they go 6'8", 6'10", 6'10", and they have a decent guard in Chase Hunter. They got to prioritize giving Arizona one look per possession and getting on that defensive glass. Before the tournament, I write notes about some of the higher seeds, about what type of teams can potentially upset them. And for Arizona, I wrote, a slower-paced team who could shoot the three had the potential to upset them. And that kind of fits the bill for Clemson. But I'll say this, it also fit the bill for Dayton, and it didn't matter. It was too little too late. Arizona's talent is just so high. I'm a fan of Brad Barnwell in general. I think Clemson could give them a scare here if they get the pace down and they keep P.J. Hall out of foul trouble. It's going to be tough with Ballo in the paint for Arizona, for P.J. Hall and Ian Shiflin to kind of stay out of that foul trouble. They should have the ability, though, on the offensive end to step out and pull him away from the basket. They can both hit the three, especially P.J. Hall. He's very versatile. So this is one of those games where, again, the pace is going to matter. Can those bigs pull Ballo away from the basket, potentially hit a couple threes and make him play out there, or potentially put him on the bench? If this becomes a track meet, it's just major advantage for Arizona.
I was going to say, it seems like that would be the path where things could snowball quickly for Clemson, although the Tigers did go on the road earlier this year, knock off UNC in a game where they needed north of 80 points to get that victory. When we look at Arizona, they've now gone under the total in 7 straight postseason games, and quite frankly, Billy, those numbers haven't even been close, with an average closing total right around 153.9 and an actual average points scored in those games just north of 130, which leads me to my follow-up question. So much when we talk about Arizona is about their offensive capabilities. What Caleb Love can do, what Ballo in the middle is, what Pelly Larson, Keelan Boswell, and everybody else. But I think what's overlooked is how good this team can be from a defensive efficiency standpoint. When you watch Arizona, I know our eyes lie and numbers don't. Are you overwhelmed with what they can do on the defensive side? Do we think it's a little smoke and mirrors, or is it something that can be the catalyst for Arizona not only to win this game, but also knock off North Carolina en route to getting to a Final Four?
They have the potential to win the whole tournament if they stay locked in on defense. The question is, we mentioned him a little bit ago, is Caleb Love. When your point guard, your point guard's generally the leader of the team. And when the leader of your team goes through, I'll just say, mental droughts throughout a basketball game, depending on how well he's shooting the ball, that can be cause for concern for Arizona. And we've seen them put up some stinkers that really don't make sense when you look at their numbers, especially on the defensive end. So if Arizona's getting good looks, scoring, you see Caleb Love engaged, this team can really beat anyone in the country, and that includes UConn and Houston. It's just, is there going to be pouting? We've seen it too much with Caleb Love and some of these guards where things are going their way, they start to pout, they look dejected, and things kind of get away from them. We saw it in the Oregon game in the Pac-12 tournament where it was just forcing threes and panicking a little bit and then not as engaged on the defensive end. So Arizona is very good defensively. They looked the part against Dayton, especially early on in that game. Even in a quicker pace game, they were very efficient on the defensive end. It's just, can they put a performance like that over 40 minutes with a team who can shoot and can score in Clemson despite playing a slower pace? People tend to think, slower pace, they're more defensive-minded. No, Clemson can score. So can Arizona stay engaged for 40 minutes? While I would venture to guess the better bet is Clemson will stay engaged. They're a very disciplined team, and even though Joe Girard can be a little bit of a liability on the defensive end, he's done a pretty decent job against two teams who have two very good guards in New Mexico and Baylor.
I know you talk to a lot of folks in and around the college basketball betting community. Have you seen anything on this game as it pertains to side and total? Knowing the market has more or less stayed pretty consistent. We did see Chris open with Arizona a 6-point favorite. They're the shortest in the market now, sitting at 7, where 7.5 is more or less the consensus. As far as the total, no real movement there. 152 is where it opened. It kind of sits at 152. There are some 151.5s out here in the desert and offshore as well.
I think the prevailing opinion amongst those I respect is Clemson at 8 is going to get taken, and this game is going to trend towards the under if you agree with the assertion that Clemson's the side. I do. We made this game a little bit shorter. We were at like 5.1, not factoring in a home court advantage for Arizona, which there should be some home court advantage for them. So we definitely lean Clemson there. I do think the slower paced team has an easier job of keeping the pace where they want it to be. If it got to 8, we'd get involved.
Hey, it's all about numbers this time of year, and I think for anybody that's listening to this show once it goes live or they're listening to it before 10 minutes before tip-off, we'll see if the market starts to take money one way or another. And one of the things when you look at favorites prevailing early on in the tournament, odds makers feel much more comfortable with some of these matchups and the numbers that they have around these Power 5 teams essentially than they would if you had some of those low major teams punching above their weight class, sneaking in here, and creating a little bit of that public perception. So not a whole lot of movement, and it speaks to the efficiency of the market, much to our chagrin more often than not. You can follow Billy on Twitter, or X, I guess I should be calling it now officially, at Watt_05. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, for all things Bet the Board podcast related, you can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod for any updates, not just about the college basketball tournament, but also all your NASCAR, NFL offseason podcasts, and maybe a little bit of golf in your near future, one way or another. From Thursday's games into Friday, and we'll head to the Midwest Regional that'll take place at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. First game on the schedule, the number 1 seed in the region, the Purdue Boilermakers, take on Gonzaga for the second time this season, and it's Purdue, a 5-point favorite, total in the game 154.5, a very similar number to what we saw the first time these two teams met in Hawaii way back when in November. Purdue is the favorite to win the region at plus 130, followed by Tennessee at plus 240. The Creighton Blue Jays and Gonzaga, both prices just shy of 5-1. When we look at Gonzaga, for a team to get here, people talked about McNeese State being a very trendy upset pick. Gonzaga dispatched all of those notions early on in a game that 86-65, probably not nearly as indicative of how one-sided that contest really was. And then the Zags found a second gear, knocking off Kansas to the tune of 89-68, despite taking some very sharp money on Kansas, at least on the screen, driving that number from 4.5 down to 3.5. The Zags outscored Kansas 46-24 in the second half, including a 28-9 surge right out of the break, finished with 5 players in double figures, did shoot 63% inside the arc. Meanwhile, Purdue, not the most difficult road to get here, but I always have to be careful. Can't be too critical of a Purdue team that wasn't afraid to lose to FDU last year, easily getting through Grambling to the tune of a 78-50 victory, and sent Danny Sprinkle for the hills, packed his bags in Logan, took his talents to Seattle to take over as head coach of Washington in the wake of a 106-67 win for Purdue. The Boilers averaged 1.43 points per possession, held Utah State well below their offensive average, and as Purdue often does, finished with a decided edge on the glass, 49-26. Billy, when we look back on that first meeting between these two teams, it's rare this late in the tournament you actually have a data point to go off of, especially one where the market hasn't moved in terms of side or total, but these two teams not constructed the exact same way. As we knew, Mark Few had a bevy of moving pieces he had to integrate, and it wasn't until maybe early February or that win that the Zags had at Rupp, knocking off Kentucky 89-85, where that light bulb clicked and they started to look like the same perennial power who's now punched their ticket to the Sweet 16 for the 9th straight season.
Yeah, they came on late. I think we were in mid-February and we weren't sure if Gonzaga was going to make the tournament or not. And they've really put together a nice run. And like you said, putting together pieces and waiting for them to click takes time. Mark Few's a fantastic coach, and obviously they got rolling late. You mentioned the first game, 73-63 victory for Purdue. And this matchup kind of feels, the question is, can Graham Ike stay out of foul trouble? It feels very much going to be a post-up battle between him and Edey. First game, Graham Ike had 4 fouls, Edey had 0. That's going to be a huge factor here. The Purdue defense doesn't really turn you over. They were 336 in defensive turnover percentage entering the tournament. This does feel like a little bit of a different type of test for Purdue than what they faced as of late. You mentioned Grambling and Utah State. They're not in the same class as Gonzaga. And the question when you're talking about Purdue and whether or not you're considering fading them, as many do, is can their guards handle the pressure? and that doesn't really fit what Gonzaga brings to the table on the defensive end. I think when we look at what they need to do on the offensive end for Gonzaga, I think we're going to need Ryan Nembhard and Anton Watson to hit some threes. Watson's 40.4% on 47 attempts for the year. In their first matchup, those two combined 1 for 11 from 3 in game 1. Nembhard specifically was 1 for 9, and he doesn't really shoot that many threes anymore. So this is a game where can they kind of pull Edey away from the basket, even though that's not what they do. It's not what Graham Ike does. I'm interested to see if Mark Few makes any adjustments in that avenue on the offensive end.
When we look at Purdue defensively, they play in a conference that's much more rigorous on a night-in, night-out basis in the Big Ten than what Gonzaga deals with in the West Coast Conference. And as a result, you see a Purdue team that's top 20 in overall defensive efficiency. However, you dig into some of their shooting defense metrics, they don't wow you by any stretch of the imagination. You talked about them not being that adept at turning teams over outside the top 300 in that department, and a Gonzaga team who leans so heavily on their guards. Now, when those guards are forced to defend against Purdue, Ike going to play a huge role in the middle. It almost begs the question, how do you go about trying to pick your poison against Purdue? Do you force Edey to score 40 to beat you and you take away everything from deep, knowing that Purdue's guards have been known to disappear in the past, although this group has performed a hell of a lot better this year than I think a lot of people anticipated? I mean, if you're Mark Few and you're dialing up the game plan, what becomes the most critical component? Is it getting out in transition, forcing Purdue into a game where maybe they don't want to run, or is it hunkering down a little bit and just trying to throw as many fresh bodies as you can at Zach Edey, leaning on a player like a Ben Gregg who wasn't a key component in any of Gonzaga's rotations early on in the season?
I think you mentioned on the offensive end, getting out in transition. Graham Ike can run. Their whole team can run. And I think I don't think enough teams force Edey to move back and forth in a transition game enough. Now, a lot of that is because Purdue's very efficient on the offensive end and they make a lot of baskets. So for Gonzaga on the offensive end, I would like to see them push a little bit more in transition. On the defensive end, I would prefer, if I was in their shoes, to play more of a high-variant game. And yes, is Purdue, have they been fantastic shooting threes this year? Without a doubt. But there's no stopping Edey. Edey is going to get his looks. He's going to get fouled. He's going to go to the line. And once he gets rolling and he kicks out consistently, everything snowballs. I think Gonzaga would be wise to do everything in their power to stop the entry pass to Edey and actually give up some more of those three-point looks. They can be contested. Obviously, they're going to be decent looks, but force some contested threes rather than allow Edey to get the ball in the paint and just go to work. Because if Graham Ike is out of the game, it's just going to be so tough for Gonzaga to get their offense going because they really do rely on him in the paint quite a bit.
Should be an interesting game when you look at contrast in styles. We know Purdue has been the perennial underachiever. Can they finally get that monkey off their back? Just 1-5 straight up in ATS in the Sweet 16 under head coach Matt Painter. Been favored in 2 of those games, losing outright to St. Peter's a few years ago and back in 2018 to Texas Tech by double digits when they came into that contest as a 2-point favorite. Talk a little bit about trying to make some of those home court adjustments. Just a stone's throw away, a little bit longer ride for about 4 hours for a prominent Purdue alumni base that could be making the trip from either Indianapolis or Chicago to Detroit for this game to see if the Boilers can get to their first Final Four in program history. The game, though, for me in this region, Billy, that intrigues me the most is going to be the nightcap, though, between Creighton and Tennessee, where we now see Tennessee a consensus 2.5-point favorite in this game. Total sits at 143, and when we mentioned the side, we did see this number get out to 3 pretty much across the board, and it was early this morning that you started to see a lot of those threes disappear from the betting market. Tennessee's road to get here knocked off St. Peter's with the greatest of ease in a game that got a little bit chippy late in that contest, 83-49, and in typical Tennessee fashion, they looked like they were going to have a comfortable, decided margin against Texas. Couldn't throw the ball in the ocean in the second half, and a 28-19 halftime advantage turns into a narrow 62-58 win, with Dalton Knecht finishing with 18 points. Vols finished with a +7 edge on the offensive glass. Maybe most impressively in the win, they were able to do so despite shooting just 3 of 25 from beyond the arc. Meanwhile, Creighton on the other side got through Akron 77-60, going 10 of 17 from 3 in that game, and were able to outlast the Oregon Ducks, much to my chagrin, as I was an Oregon backer, plus the 5 in double overtime. A game where Creighton finished with 1.13 points per possession, shot 15 of 39 from beyond the arc, and just took 36 two-point field goals in that contest. But I guess it's relatively easy and straightforward when Oregon has only 2 players that are able to score after the game goes to halftime. Before we get into some of the on-court matchups there, I think it's always important, as Tennessee fans know, for me to pick on Rick Barnes like I always do this time of year. When we look at Coach Barnes, who enters into the Sweet 16, 29-27 now straight up in his tournament career. 19 of his 27 losses, though, have come as a favorite, including all 5 with Tennessee, and 16 of those 27 losses came when his program was a better seed, including all 5 with the Volunteers. Billy, I lay out all of that to ask you this. When we start with the head coaching, Greg McDermott took his Creighton Blue Jays to the Elite 8 before they ran into San Diego State last year. Rick Barnes trying to get to the Final Four. Who do you give a coaching edge to when you're handicapping this matchup?
No doubt McDermott. I love McDermott. We've seen some money come against Creighton in both first round and second round. And it's understandable based on their variance from the three-point range. But when you're looking at the actual matchup here, Creighton doesn't really create a ton of turnovers. They're 362nd in defensive turnover percentage. So hitting the defensive glass is going to be huge for them, which they've done well all year. They're 24th in defensive rebound percentage. This, again, though, it's kind of similar to North Carolina and Alabama, as well as Arizona and Clemson, where it could be a high variance game where we see a lot of both teams hoist a lot of threes. Who's gonna cover Dalton Knecht for Creighton? That's kind of the big question here. The market liked Tennessee early on, and I completely understood why the 2.5s went to 3. But there was one shop out west, Todd, Circa Sports. They were taking 10,000 on the side. They were hanging 2.5 all week. They never moved. And I wrote in my notes that if this thing trended more towards Tennessee, we would see Blue Jay money at +4 on the buy. And actually, we, like you mentioned, we saw the buy come in 30 minutes before we started recording at +3. Tennessee does allow a ton of threes on the defensive end. They're 311th in defensive three-point attempts allowed. But when people look at that stat, they sometimes forget that many of those are just tough contested threes late in the shot clock. And you see that with the three-point shooting percentage for Tennessee's defense. 30.9%, that's 29th in college basketball. The nice thing about Tennessee is they're a team who can compete with the bully ball type teams in a Houston, in an Iowa State, and a UConn. And this year they can compete just as well with an up-paced, more finesse offensive game, which they may see in Creighton here. So advantage McDermott, the number... I wouldn't be surprised to see another buy on Tennessee at 2.5, but I just think we're right in the right spot, right? It's a game that's got a lot of variance to it. We've seen Tennessee put up stinkers from 3. Creighton's obviously the better shooting team. Who's going to get off the better looks? I would venture to guess it's going to be Tennessee. Tennessee's also very good in two-point percentage defense, which Creighton takes a lot of two-point jumpers, mid-range jumpers. That's also where Tennessee's good on the offensive end. They're 65th in mid-range jumpers in the country, and Creighton allows a bunch of them. So there's some in-game advantages that favor Tennessee, but at the end of the day, you mentioned Rick Barnes. It wouldn't surprise me come the weekend, the Final Four preview, where we're talking about, once again, a Tennessee team with all the talent, with the offensive scoring, with the defense, but they just didn't get it done in a game like this.
When I look at this game, and the total kind of jumps out to me, I know we've seen a little bit of over money where the total opened 142.5. There are a couple prominent shops offshore that are sitting at 144, and you mentioned it. I mean, Creighton, a team that's going to struggle potentially to get to the offensive glass and create any second chance points. Most likely in a game like this, they're not going to get a lot of opportunities from the free throw line, but the Jays can knock down threes with the best of them, and if Tennessee struggles to close out on some of the shooters, that's going to work out well. I mean, when you look at these two teams and the way they go about their business, I mean, Creighton's defense oftentimes gets overlooked. Do you think one of these teams is going to feel a little bit more comfortable slowing it down? I mean, if that game is played in the 60s, do both of these teams see a path to victory like we saw from Tennessee in their win against Texas, or even Creighton's game where the final score last week against Oregon rather misleading, knowing that it took double overtime for them to get to that 80-point threshold? And even when they dropped 77 on Akron in the first round, I mean, it took what felt like an outlying shooting performance to even get to that number.
Yeah, I think actually a slower-paced half-court game is better for Creighton here. And usually you don't say that with the better three-point shooting team who loves to run and get out. But Creighton is I think what happened with the Oregon game is Dana Altman is just freaking fantastic, man. He's such a good coach. They had Dante in the center, and that really stopped Creighton from even attempting to go in the paint to get anything. And you're going to look at this matchup and go, well, Tennessee's very good on the interior paint. They are, but Dante's different, man. And I don't think people were giving him enough credit for really the presence he has in the center. It stopped Kalkbrenner from being uber aggressive. You know, I was surprised looking at the stat line after the game that he finished with like 14 or 15 points because it felt to me like he had 2 buckets all game. So I think people are going to look at that Oregon game and go, A, Creighton should be out of the tournament, and B, they can't go inside against quality bigs. I really believe Dante's different, and I think Creighton's going to be able to get some good looks here. I think the half-court game benefits them, but Tennessee's going to try and run. Tennessee loves to run. They're more athletic. Creighton doesn't foul, though. They have one of the lowest rates. They might be the lowest rate of anyone in the country in fouls. Kalkbrenner's never foul. Jeez, can't say that word.
Hey, it's early on a Wednesday morning. We'll give you a chance to swallow your words and properly enunciate as needed.
Yeah, he's never fouled out of a game. So Creighton really doesn't foul. We're going to see how this one. Tennessee's uber physical on the defensive end. Creighton's a very good free throw percentage team. The number feels right. I kind of lean towards the under. I think that's kind of where you were headed a little bit. I'd rather play the under than the over here, even though we've seen a little bit of over money come in. I think Creighton is much more likely to slow this game down and play in the half court than Tennessee is.
It makes a ton of sense. And we mentioned that Oregon game. Who knows? Game could have ended very differently for Dana Altman and company if they were able to finish regulation overtime with, essentially one of their primary ball handlers in Jackson Shellstead, who looked to hyperextend his knee, and you could see that Oregon offense just run out of steam and truly bog down. But credit to Creighton, survive and advance, always the mantra of March to try and get you through. And when you look at the Jays, this is a program that is no stranger to success in the big dance, going 7-1 ATS in their last 8 NCAA tournament games. Haven't been a dog in the tournament since 2022. The lone failed attempt over that 8-game sample size was last year as a 2.5-point favorite versus San Diego State in the Elite Eight before they came up short. One final region to get to, and that is the South. When we look at the odds to win this particular region, it's the Houston Cougars remaining the favorite at a shade better than even money. The Duke Blue Devils north of 3-1. Right behind them, or I should say sandwiched between them, rather, are the Marquette Golden Eagles at plus 2.25. Shop around, some better numbers are available. And NC State, I guess by default, as the lone double-digit seed remaining in the tournament, we have to call them the Cinderella, although when you hail from the ACC, I'm not sure that particular nomenclature applies. But when we look at NC State against Marquette in the early game in the South, games that'll take place at American Airlines Arena in Dallas, Texas, Marquette a 6.5-point favorite in the contest, total of 151. And NC State got here, much to my chagrin, Billy, knocking off Texas Tech 80-67 as a 5-point underdog in a game that, quite frankly, was a swing and a miss from me as a best bet where Tech was never in that ball game. We see what DJ Burns has done, feasting on the interior as the key component of this NC State late postseason run. They held Tech in check from beyond the arc as the Red Raiders went just 7 of 31. Followed that up with a win and not a cover against Oakland, depending on the number, as it fell right at 6. Could have laid 5.5, taken 6.5 in that game where it took more than 40 minutes. State finished with a plus 12 margin on the boards, 19 assists coming on 29 made field goals as they shot 35% from beyond the arc. Meanwhile, for Marquette, sleepwalking in the first half against Western Kentucky. Kentucky found another gear in the second half, outscored the Hilltoppers 51-26 and got their backers to the window. Weren't so fortunate against Colorado. If you laid the worst of the number with Marquette on the closing line, do beat the Buffs 81-77, coming up just a half-point short as a 4.5-point favorite. Colorado utilized a 6-man rotation in the game, and you saw them start to get worn down a little bit. But I think Marquette has answered some of the questions when you look at their point guard in Tyler Kolek, second straight game with 11 assists, added 21 points. We know what Cam Jones can do to drive play as well, and Marquette was ultra efficient scoring inside the arc. When we look at these games, Billy, you always want to try and find that one edge where one team thrives and another team struggles, but both these groups are very good in transition defense. Could be a little bit tougher to turn into a high-scoring affair. NC State's ripped off 7 straight wins and plays in the Sweet 16 for the first time since 2015. Meanwhile, Marquette, look, we've seen them at their best in the second half against Western Kentucky and even in the first half against Colorado, but we've also seen sluggish halves from Shaka Smart in the past. And the one thing about Marquette, it's a team you're much more likely to back when they're catching points than laying a big number, but this potentially could be a favorable matchup for the Eagles as they continue to get healthier and see a path to getting to the Final Four out of the South.
Yeah, let's start with NC State. And so you got to acknowledge the incredible run they went on to end the season. They impressed, obviously, versus Texas Tech, like you mentioned, not what we wanted to see. And then they snuck by Oakland. DJ Burns has been fantastic. He's kind of been what people thought Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was going to be for Indiana State if they made the tournament. He's kind of been the love of the tournament. I see he just signed a NIL deal with Barstool this week, so that's something that you kind of wonder if NC State's reading the clippings a little bit here. They do, you got to factor that stuff in. You got to think about it. They have a great point guard in DJ Burns. But when I think about NC State, I just can't get out of my head that they finished 13th in the ACC in offensive effective field goal percentage, 2-point percentage offense, and defensive rebound percentage. And I think Marquette is kind of regaining the form we saw them have with a healthy Kolek. The concern for Marquette is the amount of 3-point shots they allow per game. They're 340th in college basketball in 3-point attempts allowed. And if NC State gets hot, this one can definitely stay close. I would say the guard advantage slants towards Marquette big time. I like Shaka. I think he's definitely been known to have his faults in the tournament, but I trust him over Kevin Keats. Personally, we make this number a bit higher and are kind of monitoring where this thing's going to go. I saw some 6s out there. I don't think it's going to break 6. If it did, we'd get involved. NC State's clearly riding some momentum, and DJ Burns provides a mismatch. I mean, he is in the post, he's huge, and Marquette's Iguodaro is 230. They can't really afford to get him into foul trouble. But again, man, Marquette, top 30 in offensive and defensive turnover percentage. The guard play's been phenomenal. They're going to try on offense to get Burns out on those pick and rolls, which they love to run, and maybe attack him off the dribble. This feels like a game where I don't have any interest in taking it with NC State. It's Marquette or pass for me. I think we could see NC State kind of revert back to the team they've been more the general part of the season than the team who's just been flying through the tournament. Although they could have very easily lost to Oakland, and we're not even talking about them anymore.
It's a great point. I mean, they have been the talk of the dance, and you can understand why. The improbable run to win the ACC at prices of right around 100-1 to even get to this point in the season, they've been able to capitalize on some of that momentum. One of the things that you mentioned there, the guard edge for Marquette, I'm curious to see if NC State will be patient enough in the half court to try and look for some of those good shots. The one thing that Marquette does as well as any team in the country is force their opponents to use up a ton of shot clock, holding their opponents to 361st in the country in that department, using more than 19 seconds per possession to get some of those looks. Final thing on this game that I do want to ask you, though, and I think it's always interesting because we talk in sports betting, especially in college where you have much less of a sample size than you do in the pros, about quantifying momentum. How much have you had to do to adjust some of the numbers on NC State amid this improbable late-season surge and a 7-game winning streak where they've done an outstanding job of exceeding odds makers' expectations almost on a nightly basis? basis. But at the same time, how quickly we can't ignore the fact that this team had to outlast Virginia in overtime to get here. Didn't exactly look like world beaters against Louisville in the ACC tournament. So what goes up inevitably must come down. But there's no doubt Kevin Keats' bunch playing with a bit of house money.
Yeah, I think, we talked about it with Payne the other night, is these teams who come into the tournament after winning their conference tournament in order to make the tournament, we see that momentum carry over. One team that I did not raise high enough was Oregon. Oregon, you couldn't look at what happened in the beginning of the year with Oregon. They dealt with so many injuries. By the end of the year, we saw that number close against Creighton, soft 3.5. And NC State isn't quite on that level of adjustment needed. And in general, you do want to avoid moving someone's power rating 1.5 to 3 points late in the year just because of momentum. In those first two, round of 64, round of 32, you can see the adjustment being made. But now we've got 4 days. Marquette's got time to prep. NC State's got time to read about how great they are and how great this run is. And I think after that little 4-day rest that we're having, this is more likely the spot where NC State might fall back to what they were pre-tournament rather than the way they've been playing the past 6 or 8 games. Not that they can't play better ball, which they've been playing, but are they going to be a team who, we're talking about maybe potentially touching a 5.5 point dog in this Marquette game? That number would feel like a big-time overreaction to me.
It's always interesting. I mean, odds makers are doing everything they can to scramble. People latch on to some of the storylines, and you try and find every half point of value that you can possibly extract from some of the most efficient college basketball numbers that you will see on the board all season. One final game to get to, and that, of course, is between Duke and Houston. You have to imagine that the Houston faithful will turn out. I know it's not exactly a stone's throw from Houston to Dallas, but we're still playing in the Lone Star State, and it's the Houston Cougars, a 4-point favorite, total of 134, as the ageless wonder Kelvin Sampson matches up with head coach John Shire. Duke gets here by beating Vermont 64-47 in a game that was played at a snail's pace. They turn around, smash JMU in the second round matchup, a game that wasn't played at a much faster clip either, but when you make every shot, I guess, Billy, that's what allows you to get to 93 points, as Duke hit half of its 28 attempts from long distance, won the rebounding battle, and turned the ball over just 6 times, 1.45 points per possession, and pretty much everything went in while they held the Dukes in check. Meanwhile, Houston, workmanlike effort in their opener against Longwood to the tune of 86-46, and then one of the more interesting games of the entire tournament, it's Houston outlasting Texas A&M 100-95 in a game that saw the Cougars give up a 13-3 run late that allowed the Aggies to force overtime. You went from thinking Houston was going to extend if you laid the points to thinking, okay, this team could lose the game outright as a 8.5, 9-point favorite. Houston was extremely efficient offensively, shot the ball well inside the arc, did all right from deep, but you saw their depth get pushed. Credit to Texas A&M. They weren't reluctant to try and take the ball to the rack. They have a tandem of guards as good as any in the country when they decide they want to try and take games over. When we look at the handicap in this one, 3-point line has been known to bail Duke out of a handful of games this season, but Houston's top overall defensive rank and off-the-dribble 3-point attempts could play a major factor in making life difficult. Duke oftentimes gets their toughness questioned, and I think when I look at the first way I want to handicap this, will Duke be willing to drive the ball to the rim and try and live from the foul line that gave Texas A&M so much of their offensive success?
Willing is an interesting choice of words because I'm not sure they can do that. The guards for A&M, Wade Taylor, Radford, Obaseki, they were really playing. The A&M was playing closer to a top 10 or 15 team towards the end of the year, and you saw that in those games. Those guards are quick, they're aggressive, they're physical. When we think about Duke and those who have been in the betting space in this college basketball season, the big concern has revolved around the physicality of the team overall, especially inside. And if you closed your eyes and thought about which of the 362 teams embodies toughness, grit, and just overall aggressiveness on both ends, it's Houston. Todd, me and you talked about this. How's this game going to get called? If it is a tightly called game, Duke is a very good shooting team, and there's a chance that they can get to the line quite a bit and score from there. While Houston's kind of struggled at the free throw line, they're only 288th in free throw percentage entering the tourney. But any chance of Duke winning this game interiorly with this physical presence from Mitchell and Flip, I don't see it. They finished the season 337th in offensive block percentage, which means they got their shots blocked a lot. And they're going up against the number 2 team in college basketball in defensive block percentage. Houston guards can all shoot. They're ferocious defensively. And I sent this to you yesterday. I know it gets overplayed a bit, but when we look at Duke, Jared McCain, freshman, Kyle Filipowski, sophomore, Mark Mitchell, sophomore, Tyrese Proctor, sophomore. And on the other side, you got seniors, Jamal Shed, LJ Cryer, Damian Dunn, Juwan Roberts. It has the potential to be a men versus boys matchup if the referees don't have such a tight whistle.
Hey, look, we know Houston wants to try and go out there and rough you up as best as they can. There is no doubt about that. When we look at these two teams in terms of how they want to go about their business, either one of them wants to play at a breakneck pace. We look at the Duke Blue Devils, 245th in the country in tempo, around 66.5 possessions per game on average. Meanwhile, Houston on the other side, 346th in the country. This is a team that's brutally efficient offensively, but a lot of their shooting woes and inconsistency can get masked by their ability to attack the offensive glass. When we look at Houston and how they want to try and operate, this was a team that took a lot of threes against A&M. I know that's kind of been their trademark, but we've seen them go cold from beyond the arc in multiple tournaments, and at points it's been their undoing. When we try and figure out a path and alternative strategies, if Duke takes away what Houston wants to do and Houston takes away what Duke wants to do best, who has that secondary offering that you think can allow them to adjust on the fly and make some of those changes? And I think so much of that falls on head coaches that come into this contest with such very different levels of tournament experience. Although as a Duke fan, I'd be curious to get your take on how you feel John Shire has done with the X's and O's compared to where Coach K was at the end of his tenure.
Shire's an upgrade. That's not even a question. As much as I liked Coach K growing up, as he got older, a lot of it, as it does in college basketball, it falls on your assistants. But he was more detached from that aspect. Shire's done a much better job. I'm not saying Shire's, the second coming of Christ here in college basketball, but he's done a better job with the X's and O's portion. He is getting some great... Duke recruits so well, and they get some great stars. You mentioned which team has that secondary answer. It's Houston, and his name's Jamal Shed, and for my money, he's the player I want. He's the number one player in college basketball in terms of controlling a game, who I want to have the ball with 3 minutes to go in a one-score game. I want Jamal Shed to have the ball. He makes great decisions. He's a great shooter. He's probably the best on-ball defensive guard in the country. And guards win in March. And Houston has the most experienced one. They have the best one. Obviously, the way I'm talking, you can see which way I'm leaning in this game from a side perspective. But in terms of who's got that answer, it's Houston. Especially, they're going to hit the glass. They're going to hit the glass hard on the offensive end. As long as this game isn't called super tight, it's tough for me to envision a scenario where Duke keeps this thing inside the number.
I'm also curious to see how Jeremy Roach responds to the dislocated pinky.
Yep.
Look, these guys are tough as nails. We know he taped up the finger to get back out there, but you always wonder from a ball handling and shooting perspective what that means when the finger has a chance to swell up a little bit, the adrenaline starts to subside, and anyone who's dealt with injuries of that nature knows that it's a lot different a handful of days after the injury takes place than what you can do in the few minutes where it becomes the fight or flight more than anything else to set that up. So an interesting game, contrast in styles, and for two programs that would love nothing more than to punch their ticket to the Elite Eight and have an opportunity to meet the winner of NC State Marquette. The potential for a little bit of revenge if Duke pulls off the upset and NC State does as well for an all-ACC showdown, or what I think would make for a fascinating matchup if we do get Houston and Marquette, should the chalk hold, knowing how these teams like to go about that level of physicality, crash the offensive glass, and one team that wants to push the pace and tempo with their guards. You can follow Billy on X at Watt_05. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. most importantly, as always, follow all things Bet the Board at Bet the Board Pod. And if you want, it's up to you. You can follow Payne as well at Payne Insider. And Billy, I mentioned a little bit earlier talking about the best bets and me falling flat on my face, encouraging our listeners to lay the 5 with Texas Tech. When you don't ever get outside the number at any point in a 40-minute game, it's tough to cover as a 5-point favorite in that spot. I know you and I have gone back and forth on a couple of different angles, both on regional futures, sides, totals. What have you identified with the market sitting where a lot of the prices are widely available as one of the more actionable elements going into the round of 16?
Yeah, we talked about it, and it's the game we just talked about. It's game 645, 646, Duke-Houston. First half under 63 is the direction we're going to go. I think when we look at the pace of both teams, Houston was 348th in pace on overall pace, offense and defense, because they force you into the half court. They slow you down. They do not allow second chances. And Duke is also a slow team. Duke does not play quick. They don't want to play quick. Every time you watch Shire on the bench, he's telling his point guards to slow it down. They're 229th in overall pace. These are both, Duke's 34th in height. They're a big team. I can see them giving Houston interior some problems in terms of Houston scoring, and Houston might be relying on some outside shots early to score, and if those aren't hitting, I think we could see this thing coming under. But we'd rather go first half under 63 than full game. Obviously, with the way games are reffed and end of game scenarios where teams are fouling down 10 and 12 with a minute to go and they keep fouling, we'd rather just go under 63 in the first half. But I also think you should bring up that region future that you pointed out to me yesterday.
Yeah, I think when we look at the South as well, we can stay in a region, and when you try and find prices, it's often difficult this late in the tournament to extract a lot of value. But I think you and I both agree that having a ticket on Marquette at a price of plus 225 or better to come out of the South makes an awful lot of sense, because when I forecast ahead, whether it's Houston or Duke, should Marquette get through NC State, like I think both of us agree they will, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised with how short that number is. And when we look at Shaka Smart, the one thing that we've seen from this Marquette team is that when they are an underdog, that's when they're to be absolutely feared. They have players that can drive, they can penetrate, and can defend, which I think sets up well in a matchup against Houston, if that's who they end up playing, or against the Duke team where they can stretch the floor a little bit, force Duke to get out and lean on some of that athleticism with a healthy Tyler Kolek. We know what Cam Jones can do from an offensive side. So while a lot of people sit and say, well, this time of year, aren't you better off playing a little bit of a money line rollover? I actually think the price at plus 220 on Marquette won't be available if you leaned into the money line rollover. So while we won't call it a truly official best bet, it is a recommended investment of sorts if people want to have a little bit of skin in the game. I think this is a Marquette team that I had some concerns about, and I'll be honest, Billy, coming into that opening round against Western Kentucky, knowing how fast the Hilltoppers wanted to play, and some of them manifested in the first 20 minutes, but then you saw Marquette find another gear. They carried some of that momentum forward against Colorado, and while people go, well, they didn't look that great in the second half against the Buffs, credit Tad Boyle and company. I mean, that is a well-coached team, a player in Cody Williams, who I watched this tournament, and that's a different discussion for a different day, being talked about as a potential lottery pick, but you have veterans in KJ Simpson and Hanley that can provide matchup issues and challenges. So I think this Marquette team is battle-tested. We've seen the Big East exceed odds makers' expectations, and I don't think you or I would be shocked whatsoever if 3 Big East teams were playing into the Elite Eight, and we'll see exactly what unfolds in the NIT as well, where Seton Hall takes on my local boys in the UNLV Runnin' Rebels. So maybe a scenario for the Big East to get the NCAA tournament and NIT sweep, because we know that's what every conference loves to hang their hat on.
No doubt. And one more point on Marquette. Doesn't it feel like getting to the Sweet 16 this year was like kind of getting over the hump for Shaka? Especially with the adversity they faced. When they got down in that first half to Western Kentucky, you're just thinking to yourself, here we go again. Like, yep, they're gonna fall flat on their face. They got all the talent in the world, and then they answered, and they did so, hitting some big threes, some tough shots, and then they win that game versus Western Kentucky. They go take on Colorado. First half, they come out guns a-blazing. It looks like they're gonna have that game wrapped up, and then boom, more adversity. Colorado comes back, takes the lead late. Marquette answers again. It just feels like this team's a little different, a little more confident. They went through the rigors of the Big East despite only getting 3 teams in the tournament. The Big East was a very tough conference this year, and they matched up with UConn, I believe, 3 times. And so Marquette's not going to be intimidated by anybody, including Houston. As much as I love Houston, they're not going to be intimidated. They face tough teams all year. And when we're also talking about a team who's a 6.5-point favorite in the Sweet 16, the second highest favorite behind, or third highest favorite behind UConn and Arizona, I think it's a good look, especially when, that number versus Duke. If Duke beats Houston, Duke's going to get a ton of respect in the market. But Duke, anything more than a 2-point favorite, a 1-point favorite in that game, you're going to see Marquette money there. So,
yep.
I think they match up well with Houston.
For sure, and that's kind of what you're looking for this time of year. And hey, I mean, a lot of the favorites have held. You haven't seen a ton of adjustments in a number of these teams when it comes to their odds to win the region, and that's because the big boys are still out there cooking. I think the biggest mover was UConn, going from right around even money to moving to minus $1.90, knowing that they draw San Diego State in the round of 16 instead of the potential matchup that we looked like we were going to get on paper should the seeds have held, and they took on the Auburn Tigers. All right, my friend, appreciate you jumping in the hot seat this week to talk all things Sweet 16, give people a little bit of a rooting interest past Thursday and Friday should Marquette get through NC State, and have a little sweat on Sunday as well. Any other final words of wisdom, parting shots, things you'd like to share with our lovely Bet the Board listeners who I know are chomping at the bit to get back at it for what should be 8 outstanding basketball games in the Sweet 16?
Nothing substantial here. We're just we're big Creighton fans this year. We took a lot of Final Four futures on that team, so hoping they can slide by Tennessee, even though that's a really tough matchup. I will say I like the winner of that game against Purdue. Depending, I anticipating what that number would be. That'll be we'll be looking to get involved there.
Look, I know Tennessee was another team that took a lot of money in terms of the big picture markets as far as overall futures to get to the Final Four and win the region as well. So all eyes, no doubt, will be on Creighton and Tennessee late Friday night with that tip-off coming from Little Caesars Arena.
Todd, who's a favorite in that game? Tennessee, Purdue. What do you think they open that game at?
You know what? Where they should open.
Where they do, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Purdue opens a short favorite in that game, but for me, I'd open that thing right around pick'em, and I'd make somebody bet me one way or another.
Exactly. That would be a great way to book that game, and I think Tennessee takes the money there.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would have no problems right there alongside you, backing the Vols in that spot, knowing the physicality, knowing that they could the way they could defend the interior. And I think on some level, all the naysayers, myself included, about Rick Barnes' resume, that some of that coaching disadvantage gets minimized when you're talking about a 36-hour turnaround between Matt Painter, who leaves a lot to be desired on his resume, and Rick Barnes as well. So one of those two teams would have to be able to go out there, not dribble down their leg, and get to the Final Four. So it's the kind of things you like to see, because these coaches, you discount them until they finally get over the hump. We did it for so many years with Jay Wright, and the rest of history wrote itself when he turned that Villanova program into an absolute juggernaut. But thank you again, Billy. Appreciate all your contributions and your in-depth breakdowns. To all of you, our Bet the Board listeners, wish you nothing but the best of luck with all of your investments this weekend. And most importantly, come Friday night with a Marquette ticket to win the region for a smaller position and a Houston Duke first half under ticket in hand. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.